In the late 1990s, in a small, quiet town nestled in rural New York, there were two teenage girls named Rachel and Molly, and they were best friends. They were part of a larger circle of friends, a tight-knit group that navigated the halls of their high school together. But Rachel and Molly had a bond that was a little different, a little deeper. What really drew them together, what formed the core of their friendship and their social circle, was a shared love for goth culture. Now, if you remember the late 90s and the early 2000s, being a goth kid in high school was a very specific identity. It meant a wardrobe composed almost entirely of the color black. It meant black nail polish, black lipstick, and almost always dyed black hair. It was about embracing all things dark and macabre. For some, it was a profound philosophical stance, a way of looking at the world that acknowledged the shadows. For others, it was more of a fashion statement, a way to stand out. But for Rachel and Molly, it was a bit of both. They were committed to the aesthetic, but they also genuinely loved the whole vibe, the art, the music, the literature. It was their world, and one of the central activities in their world, something that became a ritual for them and their friends, was hanging out in the local cemetery. At first, it was almost a joke. They were the goth kids, so of course they would hang out in a cemetery. It felt a little on the nose, a bit of a cliche they wanted to lean into for the sheer irony of it all. So the whole group went out there one evening, almost as a dare to themselves, to fulfill the stereotype. But then, something unexpected happened. They discovered that they actually liked it there. The cemetery was peaceful. It was quiet. It was a place where they could be themselves, away from the judgment of their classmates and the prying eyes of their parents. It became their spot, their go-to hangout, especially on the weekends. Typically, when Rachel, Molly, and the rest of their friends went to the cemetery, they'd go at night. This was partly to maximize the atmosphere, to really lean into the whole dark, gothic aesthetic they loved so much. But there was another, more practical reason they always went as a group. A cemetery at night, no matter how much you romanticize it, is still a little bit creepy. There was a sense of safety in numbers. The laughter and chatter of their friends cut through the silence and kept the deeper, more unsettling feelings at bay. It was fun with a group. It felt safe with a group. So, it was an unspoken rule that Rachel and Molly never went there alone, just the two of them. It was always a package deal, the whole crew or nothing. One particular Friday night, the air was starting to get that cool autumn crispness to it. Rachel was at home, probably listening to music in her room when the phone rang. It was Molly. Her voice was cheerful on the other end of the line. She asked, "Hey, want to go hang out at the cemetery?" And Rachel's immediate thought was, of course, that's what they did on a Friday night. It was the plan. She said, "Duh, I'd love to go. Come pick me up. Let's go." So Rachel got ready. She pulled on her favorite black jeans, a band t-shirt, and her worn-in combat boots. She applied a fresh coat of dark lipstick and waited by the front door. A little while later, she saw the familiar headlights of Molly's car pull into her driveway. But as she walked out, the first thing she noticed was that the car was empty, except for Molly in the driver's seat. There was no one else. Usually the car would be full, a hub of noise and energy as their friends piled in. This was different. Rachel opened the passenger door and slid into the seat, a question already on her lips. She looked over at Molly and asked, "Hey, so where is everybody? Are we going to pick them up now?" Molly gave a little shrug, her hand still on the steering wheel. She said, "Actually, no. I tried calling everyone, but people are either busy or they have to work, or they're still recovering from last night. It's just going to be us two tonight. Is that okay?" And Rachel felt a little knot of unease in her stomach. It wasn't okay, not really. This wasn't how they did things. It wasn't about her trust in Molly. They were as close as sisters. It was about the place. The cemetery. At night. Alone. The idea felt uncomfortable, a little too vulnerable. The safety of the group was a crucial part of the experience, but she looked at Molly, who seemed to have already made peace with the idea. Molly was ready to go, and Rachel didn't want to be the one to back out, to be a buzzkill. She didn't want to be rude, so she pushed her hesitation down and forced a smile. "Oh yeah, that's fine," she said, trying to make her voice sound convincing. "It'll be great. Just the two of us. Let's go." And with that, even with the reluctance lingering in the back of her mind, she settled into her seat. Molly put the car in drive, and they pulled away from the house, heading the short half-mile towards the old cemetery. This cemetery was enormous. It was one of those sprawling, ancient places with tombstones that dated back centuries. As they pulled up to the entrance, the first thing you saw was this huge, medieval-looking gate. It was a massive stone archway that stretched across the entrance road with big, wrought iron gates that were permanently chained open. It was a very gothic, very dramatic entrance, and it set the tone for the whole place. Once you drove through that archway, you were on a long, straight road that cut right through the middle of the cemetery, all the way to the back. It was a huge property, probably over a mile from the front gate to the back fence. This central road effectively split the cemetery into two distinct halves, a right side and a left side, and the spot where Rachel, Molly, and their friends always hung out was in the back left corner. They loved this area for a very specific reason. The left side of the cemetery was full of rolling hills, gentle slopes where the plots were laid out, and in that far back left corner, there was a natural depression in the earth, a shallow little valley. In this depression, there weren't many tombstones. Instead, there was a big moss-covered boulder and a gnarled old tree right next to it. It was a perfect hideaway. If you were standing at the front gate and scanning across the vast expanse of the cemetery, you wouldn't be able to see anyone who was down in that little depression. They were completely tucked away, hidden by the lay of the land. For a group of teenagers looking for a private place to hang out, it was ideal. It was their sanctuary away from the world. So, Rachel and Molly drove through the imposing stone gate, the familiar crunch of gravel under the tires. They made their way down that long central road all the way to the very back of the cemetery. By now, the sun had almost completely set. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, and the long shadows of the tombstones were melting into the growing darkness. It was quiet, utterly still. There was no one else around, which wasn't unusual. The place was almost always deserted. Occasionally, on the other side of the cemetery, the far right-hand side, some of the college kids from the local university would hop the fence. They had a spot over there where they'd sometimes build a bonfire right up against the fence line. It was totally against the rules, but they would sneak over and do it every now and then. But that was a rare occurrence. Other than those occasional trespassers, the cemetery was their private domain. They reached the end of the road and Molly parked the car. They got out, the car doors closing with a dull thud that seemed incredibly loud in the silence. They walked from the road, across the damp grass, and down the gentle slope into their familiar depression. Once they were at the bottom, they settled into their usual spots. They took up positions on the big boulder, leaning their backs against the rough bark of the old tree. They lit up cigarettes and just started talking. This was their routine. They were just two goth teenagers in rural New York in the late 1990s doing what they did. They talked about everything and nothing. They swapped stories about their boyfriends, complained about teachers, and dissected the latest drama at school. As time passed, the last bit of light faded from the sky, and it became fully dark. A blanket of stars appeared overhead, and in the quiet comfort of their spot, the girls were just having a nice time. Rachel even thought to herself that this was actually kind of nice. It wasn't as scary as she'd imagined it would be. It was just good, quality time with her best friend, but after they'd been there for a while, a new scent drifted to them on the gentle breeze. It was the smell of smoke. Wood smoke. Immediately, their minds went to the college kids, that bonfire spot on the complete opposite side of the cemetery. It was a long way off, but the smell of a bonfire could carry. When they had first arrived, they had glanced over in that direction and hadn't seen anything, but they'd been hanging out for a good while now. It was entirely possible that in the time they'd been down in their depression, a group of students had hopped the fence, started a fire, and that was what they were smelling. Now, a fire on the other side of the cemetery didn't directly affect them. They were on opposite ends of the property. But they knew from experience what a bonfire meant. It meant that, eventually, the police would show up. Someone would eventually see the flames and call it in. The police would come, they would make the college kids put out their fire, and then they would do a full sweep of the entire cemetery to kick out anyone else who was trespassing. That included them. So, Rachel and Molly looked at each other. They didn't even need to say anything. They both had the same thought. They should probably just pack it up and leave now before the cops arrived and made them leave. Besides, they had been there for quite a while. They were getting ready to head home anyway. This just sped up the timeline a bit. It was no big deal. They put out their last cigarettes, gathered their things, and turned to walk back up the hill, back the way they had come, towards the road where Molly's car was parked. As they walked up the grassy slope, they expected to reach the top, crest the hill, and see their car waiting for them. They expected to look out across the vast, dark cemetery and maybe, just maybe, see the distant flicker of the bonfire way off on the other side. But when they reached the top of the hill and their eyes adjusted, that's not what they saw. Their car was there, right where they left it. But when they looked for the fire, it wasn't on the far side of the cemetery at all. Instead, just to their right, maybe 100 meters away, they saw it. There was another depression in the landscape over there, another rolling hill that dipped down out of sight. And rising from that depression, they could see the tops of flickering flames. A fire was burning right there, on their side of the cemetery, practically next to them. This was wrong. This was completely out of the ordinary. They knew for a fact that they were alone on this side when they arrived. There was nobody else here. So, sometime while they were down in their spot, someone else had shown up and started a fire. They had never seen anyone do this over here. It wasn't the college kids' spot. This was something new and it was unsettling. Their first thought was a mix of curiosity and caution. Who was over there? Had the college kids decided to move to a new spot? They couldn't see the person or the people around the fire, only the orange flames licking up over the edge of the hill. They were sure that whoever was over there had no idea that they were right here, just one hill over. A mischievous idea popped into Molly's head. She whispered to Rachel, "What if we go back down and sneak up the other side of our hill? We could peek over and see who it is. We could spy on them." The idea was intriguing. They were already there. Why not? So the two girls turned around and walked back down into the base of their own depression. They passed the big rock and the tree where they had been sitting for the past couple of hours and started walking up the opposite slope, the one that bordered the neighboring depression with the fire. They moved as quietly as they could, trying to be stealthy. As they got closer and closer to the top of the hill, the smell of smoke got stronger and they could hear the soft crackle of the fire. Just as they were about to reach the crest where they would be able to peer over and see everything, Rachel's foot came down on a dry branch. It snapped with a loud crack that seemed to echo in the silent night. The only other sound was the fire. They hadn't heard any voices, no music, no laughter, just the crackle of flames. The sudden noise Rachel made felt like a gunshot. She instantly clapped her hands over her mouth and looked at Molly with wide, apologetic eyes. Molly shot her a look that said, "What are you doing? We're supposed to be sneaking." And then they both just froze. They stood perfectly still, listening, waiting to see if they had been heard, but there was no reaction from the other side of the hill. Just silence. An eerie, heavy silence. And in that moment, the entire mood shifted. The playful, adventurous feeling was gone, replaced by a cold sense of dread. They hadn't even reached the top of the hill yet. They hadn't seen who was at the fire, but something just felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. The two girls looked at each other, and the same thought was reflected in their eyes. Maybe this was a bad idea. Maybe they should just turn around and leave. They both nodded in silent agreement. "Yeah, let's get out of here," one of them whispered. "This doesn't feel right." So right then and there, as quietly as they could, they turned and retreated. They walked back down to the center of their depression, past the rock and the tree, and started walking back up the original side of the hill, the side that led to their car. They were halfway up the slope, their backs to the fire, when for some reason, Rachel glanced back over her shoulder. She looked back towards the hill they had just been on, the one they were trying to spy from. And what she saw made her blood run cold. There was a man standing on the ridgeline now. The fire was behind him, silhouetting his figure, making him a dark, ominous shape against the flickering orange light. He was just standing there, perfectly still, staring directly in their direction. He wasn't saying anything. He was just watching them. It was clear now. He was the one at the fire. He must have heard the noise they made. Rachel's heart leaped into her throat. She whipped her head around and grabbed Molly's arm. "Molly, look, look, look!" she hissed. Molly turned, and her eyes widened in fear. "Let's get out of here," she said, her voice trembling. "We don't know who that is. We have to go, now." And with that, they broke into a frantic, scrambling walk up the rest of the hill. A second later, Rachel risked another look back. The man was no longer on the hill. For a terrifying split second, she thought he was gone. But then she saw movement in the darkness of the depression between the hills. He was running, he was coming down the hill, and he was coming right for them. The girls started screaming. Pure, instinctual terror. They stopped walking and started sprinting, their feet stumbling on the uneven ground. They ran for the car, their lungs burning. Rachel kept looking back, and the man was gaining on them. He was fast. They finally reached the road, their feet pounding on the asphalt. They scrambled to Molly's car, yanking on the door handles. They jumped inside, slammed the doors shut, and fumbled to lock them. Molly jammed the key into the ignition, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn it. The engine roared to life. She threw the car into reverse, then into drive, and stomped on the gas pedal. The tires squealed as they sped away down the long, dark cemetery road. As they were driving, Rachel looked out the back window one last time. She saw the man. He had reached the road just a few feet from where their car had been. He had almost caught them. He stood there for a moment, watching them drive away, and then he slowly, deliberately turned and walked back down the hill. Disappearing into the darkness, they were both completely shaken up. Their hearts were pounding, and they were breathing in ragged gasps. That was not a college kid. That was a grown man, maybe in his 40s, someone they had never seen before. The whole situation was just so creepy, so wrong. They didn't know what to make of it. As Molly drove Rachel home, the adrenaline started to wear off, replaced by a shaky confusion. What would have happened if he had reached them? What did he want? What was he doing out there with a fire all by himself? But by the time Molly pulled up to Rachel's house, they had started to process the fear by turning it into a crazy story. They were trying to downplay it, to make it seem less terrifying than it was. "Man, that was crazy, huh?" Molly said, trying to laugh it off. They chalked it up to just a weird, scary night. A story they'd tell their friends on Monday. A warning to themselves to never go to the cemetery alone again. Rachel got out of the car and went inside her house. She didn't even tell her mom what had happened. She was still too wired and confused. She just put her stuff down, went to her room, and tried to calm her racing heart. Molly drove to her own house and did the same. She didn't tell anyone. She just went to her room and eventually fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, Rachel woke up feeling groggy. She went downstairs to the kitchen to get some breakfast. Her mom was already in there going about her morning routine, making coffee. When she saw Rachel, she smiled and asked casually, "Hey, how was your night last night?" Rachel just shrugged. "Oh, it was fine. Me and Malthy went out. Nothing special." Her mom nodded, then her expression turned a bit more serious. "Oh, did you hear what happened last night?" she asked. Rachel shook her head. "No, what do you mean?" "What happened?" Her mom took a sip of her coffee. Well, she said, a woman in our town was kidnapped. She paused for a moment. She was actually taken from the same parking garage where I park for work. She worked in the same building as me. Rachel felt a jolt of alarm. Oh my God, she said. What happened to her? Did they find her? Rachel's mom looked at her and her face was grim. No, she said softly. Unfortunately, it was too late. When they found her, she was dead. And then she delivered the final, devastating piece of information. In fact, whoever kidnapped and killed her, they brought her body to the local cemetery last night, and they burned her in a huge bonfire. Her mom's voice dropped to a whisper, and they still haven't caught the person who did it. When Rachel heard those words, it was like the entire world tilted on its axis. Everything came crashing down. Suddenly, she understood exactly what had happened the night before. That fire wasn't just a fire. That man wasn't just some random creep. He was the killer. That fire they had smelled, the one they had almost walked right up to, it very likely contained the body of that poor woman. They had been right there, no more than 100 meters away while this horrific act was taking place. It was even more terrifying to realize that they were probably there when the killer first arrived, when he set everything up, when he started that fire. And the most chilling thought of all, what would have happened if he had caught them? What was he trying to do when he chased them? Was he trying to silence the only witnesses to his crime? A wave of nausea washed over Rachel. She started to tremble and she poured her heart out to her mom. She told her everything, about Molly calling, about going to the cemetery alone, about the strange fire, about the man on the hill, about the terrifying chase to the car. Her mom listened, her face growing paler with every word. When Rachel finished, her mom was horrified. Oh my God, she said, pulling Rachel into a hug. I can't believe this happened. You have to tell the police. They haven't caught this guy yet. You saw him. You have a description of him. You have to talk to them. So that's what they did. Rachel immediately got on the phone and called Molly, telling her what she had just learned. Molly became hysterical on the other end, crying, barely able to speak. They couldn't believe how close they had come to a truly terrible fate. They went to the police station together. They sat down with a detective and told him everything they could remember about the man. Unfortunately, their description wasn't much to go on. It had been dark, and they had been terrified. All they could really say was that he looked to be about average height, maybe in his 40s. It wasn't a lot for the police to work with, but it was something, and luckily they wouldn't have to rely on that description alone. Just 48 hours later, the police got the break they needed. It wasn't because of the girl's description, but because of a bit of luck and good police work. An officer on patrol spotted the victim's car being driven around town. A BOLO, a be on the lookout alert, had been issued for the vehicle. The officer pulled the car over, and the person behind the wheel was the killer. After he was arrested, he made a full confession to the kidnapping and the murder. Rachel and Molly were safe. The man who had chased them was behind bars. But they would never forget that night. They thought back to that moment when Rachel accidentally stepped on the branch, making that loud noise. At the time, it felt like a stupid mistake, a clumsy move that could have gotten them caught spying. But now, they realized it was the sound that had likely saved their lives. That noise made them pause, it made them feel uneasy, it made them rethink their decision and turn back. If that hadn't happened, if they had continued up and over that hill, they would have come face to face with a killer in the middle of him disposing of a body. And it's almost certain that two teenage girls, the only witnesses to his crime, would have ended up in that bonfire as well. Their favorite hangout spot, a place they once saw as a sanctuary of ironic coolness, was now forever tainted by the memory of what they almost stumbled into, and the terrifying reality of the darkness that can hide in the most familiar places. Stories like this are terrifying because they remind us how close ordinary people can come to extraordinary evil without ever realizing it. One normal Friday night, one familiar place, one small decision, and suddenly everything changes. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all. Sometimes the darkest moments don't begin with screams or warning signs. Sometimes they begin in silence. Until next time. Day one, sometimes the most terrifying and tragic secrets are hiding in plain sight, captured on cameras we never look at, buried in places we pass by every single day, or locked inside objects we would never think to open. Today, we are going to dive deep into 3 incredibly chilling cases where the truth was eventually uncovered, but only after a series of bizarre, unexpected, and haunting events. These are stories about ordinary people whose lives took sudden, drastic turns, and the strange clues that finally brought their secrets to light. Our first story begins on a cool autumn day on November 2nd, 2020, in a quiet, peaceful place called Wannsee, Belgium. This was a small, tight-knit town where everyone knew their neighbors, and life moved at a slow, comfortable pace. In this town lived an older man named Marcel Terray and his 83-year-old wife Paulette Landrieu. They had been married for decades, sharing a beautiful, long life together, raising their children, and eventually settling into a quiet retirement. But over the last few years, their peaceful life had become much more challenging. Paulette had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. This is a progressive and heartbreaking condition that slowly destroys a person's memory, their sense of direction, and their ability to care for themselves. Because of this, Marcel had transitioned from being just her husband to her full-time caregiver. He did this gladly, out of deep and profound love for his wife, but it was an exhausting and constant job. Paulette would often forget to eat, forget to take her crucial medications, or become completely confused about where she was. Sometimes she would simply wander off without telling Marcel, and he would have to quickly run out, search the neighborhood, find her, and gently bring her back home. On this particular afternoon, around 1 in the afternoon, Marcel was busy trying to get some household chores done. But before he did anything, he wanted to make sure Paulette was safe and comfortable. He lovingly prepared a nice lunch for her and sat her down on the living room couch, right in front of the television. He tuned the TV to her favorite show, hoping it would keep her entertained and calm. Seeing her smiling and eating, Marcel felt it was safe to step away for just a few minutes. He wanted to go into the backyard to hang some wet laundry on the clothesline. He picked up his empty laundry basket, stepped out the back door, and walked into the cool air. He took his time, shaking out each shirt, pegging them carefully to the line, and enjoying the quiet moment of peace. It was a simple, routine chore that took him no more than 15 minutes. When he finished, he gathered his empty basket and walked back inside the house. He expected to see his wife sitting on the couch, watching her show. But when he walked into the living room, the television was still playing, her half-eaten lunch was on the table, and the couch was completely empty. Paulette was gone. Marcel immediately began calling out his wife's name, his voice echoing through the quiet house. He walked into the kitchen, thinking she might have gone to get a glass of water, but she was not there. He checked the bedroom, the bathroom, the closets, and even the garage. The house was completely silent. At this point, a sharp knot of worry began to form in his stomach. He ran out to the front yard and looked down the quiet street, but the road was completely empty. He began knocking on his neighbors' doors, asking them if they had seen an elderly woman walking by in the last few minutes. But one by one, the neighbors shook their heads. Nobody had seen her. Marcel was now in a state of sheer panic. Given her severe Alzheimer's, Paulette could easily wander onto a busy road, get lost in the woods, or fall into a ditch without understanding how to get back. She was incredibly vulnerable, and the weather was beginning to cool down as the afternoon progressed. Realizing he could not find her on his own, Marcel picked up his phone and frantically dialed the police. Within an hour, the quiet, sleepy neighborhood of Wannsee was transformed into a chaotic search zone. The police took the report of a missing Alzheimer's patient extremely seriously. They immediately launched a massive search operation. Police helicopters buzzed overhead, using thermal imaging cameras to scan the surrounding fields and woods. Canine units were brought in, sniffing Paulette's slippers to catch her scent, and then tracking through the grass and driveways. At least half a dozen officers spread out across the neighborhood, knocking on every single door, talking to residents, and looking for any residential security cameras that might have captured her direction of travel. Marcel stood on his front porch, watching the searchlights and listening to the sirens. He was terrified, but he also felt a glimmer of hope. He believed that with such a massive search effort, they would surely find his wife and bring her home safely. But as the hours ticked by, the sun began to set, and the cold night air rolled in, there was still absolutely no sign of Paulette. The search party kept looking late into the night, but they found nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no clues. As the days turned into weeks, the intense search began to slow down. The police kept investigating, but they had absolutely no leads. Weeks eventually turned into months, and months turned into 2 full years. 2 years of painful, agonizing silence. By this point, Marcel had resigned himself to a heartbreaking reality. He believed that he would likely live out the rest of his days without ever knowing what had happened to his beloved wife. He had to live in that quiet house, staring at her empty chair, tormented by the mystery of her disappearance. But then, in early October of 2022, 2 years after Paulette vanished, one of Marcel's neighbors was sitting at home on their computer. They were just passing the time scrolling through the internet when they decided to look at Google Maps. Specifically, they decided to look at the Google Street View of their own neighborhood. For those who do not know, Google Street View is a feature that allows users to see 360-degree photographic views of streets all over the world. To create these images, Google sends out special cars equipped with massive multi-directional cameras mounted on their roofs. These cars drive down public roads, constantly taking panoramic photos of everything around them. As the neighbor was clicking through the virtual streets of Wannsee, they zoomed in on the road right outside Marcel and Paulette's house. And suddenly they froze. Their heart began to hammer in their chest. There on the screen was a photograph that took their breath away. The photograph showed their familiar street on a bright, sunny day. On the right side of the image, in the background of Marcel's yard, you could clearly see Marcel himself standing by the clothesline hanging up his wet laundry. And on the left side of the image, walking away from the house and directly crossing the street, was Paulette. The Google camera car had happened to drive down their exact road, taking photos, at the exact 15-minute window on November 2, 2020, when Paulette had wandered out of her house. The neighbor was completely stunned. They realized they were looking at the final, captured moment of Paulette before she disappeared. They quickly took a screenshot of the image and rushed it to the local police station. When the detectives saw the photograph, they were absolutely amazed. During the initial search 2 years prior, they had focused heavily on the immediate surroundings of the house, the nearby woods, and the neighboring streets. But they had never looked closely at the exact path Paulette was taking in the Google photo. In the image, she was baining straight across the road, heading toward a property directly opposite her home. The police immediately went back to the scene. They stood in the exact spot where the Google car had taken the picture, and they looked in the direction Paulette was walking. Across the street was a steep, grassy hill that sloped sharply downward, ending in a very dense, overgrown bramble bush filled with thick branches and sharp thorns. The officers walked across the street, went down the steep slope, and began carefully cutting their way through the thick, thorny brush. And deep inside that heavy bramble bush, they made a tragic, heartbreaking discovery. They found the remains of Paulette Landrieu. It became clear to the investigators what had actually happened on that autumn afternoon. After wandering out of her house, Paulette had walked straight across the road, just as the Google camera car captured. In her confused and disoriented state, she had lost her footing at the edge of the road and fell down the steep, slippery hill. She landed directly inside the thick, thorny bramble bush. Because of her advanced age and her fragile physical condition, she was completely trapped. She could not climb back up the steep slope, and she could not push her way out of the dense, interlocking thorns. She was likely too weak or too confused to call out for help, or perhaps the thick vegetation muffled her cries. She had remained trapped in that bush, just yards away from her own home, while the massive search party, helicopters, and dogs searched everywhere else. It was a devastating end, but thanks to a random Google camera car and a curious neighbor, Marcel finally got the closure he had spent 2 agonizing years searching for. Our second story takes us to Jingzhou City in central China on the morning of July 26, 2015. It was a warm, bright Sunday, and a 31-year-old mother named Xiang Lujuan, along with her husband, had decided to take their 2-year-old son out for a fun family day. They decided to go to a brand new, modern shopping mall in the center of the city. On the 6th floor of this mall, there was a massive, state-of-the-art indoor playground. It was a paradise for young children filled with colorful ball pits, small climbing walls, and various slides. The little boy was absolutely thrilled. He ran around in circles, giggling and screaming with joy, while Xiang and her husband happily chased after him. Xiang caught up to her son, scooped him up in her arms, and carried him to the top of a small plastic slide. He slid down to the bottom, laughing, and when he reached the ground, he stood up, looked past his mother, pointed, and began repeating the word, "Ride, ride." Xiang turned around to see what had caught her son's attention. Right next to the indoor playground were 2 large, modern escalators. One was moving upward to the 7th floor, and the other was moving downward. To a 2-year-old boy, these moving metal stairs looked like a fun amusement park ride, just another attraction for him to play on. Xiang smiled warmly at her husband and told him that she was going to take their son for a quick ride on the escalator. She took her son's hand, and they began walking over to the ascending escalator. But as they reached the entrance of the moving stairs, the little boy suddenly became hesitant. The moving metal steps and the mechanical humming sound seemed a bit scary up close. Xiang, who had ridden escalators countless times, knelt down and gently reassured him. She told him it was completely safe, held his hand tightly, and coaxed him to step onto the moving stairs. He finally agreed, stepping onto the step right alongside his mother, holding her hand. As the escalator slowly carried them upward, the little boy calmed down and seemed to enjoy the ride. About halfway up the escalator, Xiang turned her attention toward the top landing on the 7th floor where they were heading. She noticed 3 female mall employees standing right at the top of the escalator. But the problem was, these employees did not look relaxed. They had extremely tense, serious expressions on their faces, and they were staring directly down at Xiang and her son. They began gesturing wildly, waving their hands and pointing at the metal platform right at the very top of the escalator where passengers step off. Xiang was completely confused. The mall was noisy and she could not hear what they were saying. The employees were gesticulating broadly, but they were not clearly communicating what the issue was. They were not waving her to go back down, and they did not press the emergency stop button. They just stood there, gesturing anxiously. Xiang looked up at them, trying to figure out what was going on, but the escalator kept moving, carrying her and her young son closer and closer to the top landing. Finally, they reached the top of the stairs, and Xiang stepped off onto the metal landing platform. And in that split second, she suddenly understood what the employees were gesturing about. But by then, it was already too late. Down on the 6th floor, Xiang's husband was still waiting by the playground watching his family. Suddenly, he heard the sharp, terrifying sound of his wife and son screaming from the top of the escalator. Instinctively, he bolted towards the escalator and began running up the moving steps. But as he looked up, someone at the top screamed at him to stop and get off the escalator. He froze in sheer panic. Right then, one of the mall employees came running down the opposite, descending escalator, carrying his 2-year-old son. The employee, who was pale and visibly shaking in shock, handed the crying boy to the husband. She shook her head in horror, unable to speak. The husband looked up, but his wife was nowhere to be seen. It would turn out that earlier that morning, the mall employees had discovered a major defect with the metal landing platform at the top of the escalator on the 7th floor. The metal plate, which covers the internal machinery, was loose and completely unstable. But instead of immediately shutting down the escalator, blocking it off with warning signs, and calling for an emergency repair, the employees had simply allowed the escalator to continue running. They had stationed themselves at the top to warn people. But when Xiang and her son boarded, the employees failed to communicate the extreme danger. When Xiang stepped off the escalator onto the metal plate, her weight caused the unstable panel to immediately cave in. Beneath that panel was the heavy, rotating machinery of the escalator, filled with massive, moving metal gears and sharp teeth. As the plate collapsed, Xiang began to fall into the rotating gears. In her final, agonizing moments of life, as she was being pulled down into the machinery, she did not try to save herself. Instead, she used her remaining strength to lift her 2-year-old son high above her head and thrust him forward into the arms of the nearby mall employees, who grabbed him and pulled him to safety. But Xiang was dragged down into the gears and killed. The horrific incident was captured on the mall's security cameras, and the footage quickly spread, sparking nationwide grief and outrage over the extreme safety failures. A full-scale government investigation followed, identifying massive safety violations by both the company that manufactured the escalator and the mall management. 2 people were ultimately arrested and criminally charged in connection with Xiang's death. The mall reportedly offered a financial settlement to her family, though the details were kept private. Xiang's final heroic act saved her son's life, but it left a family completely shattered by a senseless tragedy that could have been easily avoided. Our third and most disturbing story takes us to Bradenton, Florida, a small, humid city located just south of Tampa. It was a warm morning in November of 1997. A police captain named Jeffrey Lewis, along with his partner, was driving their patrol car near the Manatee River. Just a few minutes earlier, the Bradenton Police Department had received a frantic, breathless call from a local citizen. The man had been walking along the sandy shoreline of the river when he spotted something highly suspicious and deeply disturbing washed up in the wet sand. Captain Lewis and his partner pulled their squad car over near the riverbank and got out to investigate. As soon as they stepped onto the sand, the man who had called the police saw them and quickly waved them down. He was standing several yards away, pointing down at something in the wet sand. Captain Lewis and his partner walked over, and before they even spoke to the man, they looked down at what he was pointing at. Right away, they understood why the man was so terrified. Sitting there on the sand, being lapped by the river waves, was a severed human hand. Captain Lewis's first thought was that they were dealing with a tragic wildlife accident. The Manatee River was known to be inhabited by large, aggressive alligators. Despite warnings, people occasionally went swimming in the river, and attacks did happen. Lewis wondered if a swimmer had been attacked by an alligator and lost their hand. But when he knelt down to examine the hand more closely, he realized that was highly unlikely. If an alligator had torn the hand off, the wound would be jagged, shredded, and extremely messy. But this hand had been removed with almost surgical precision. The cut was incredibly neat and clean, as if a trained professional had carefully amputated it. This signaled to Captain Lewis that this was not an animal attack. It was a murder. Someone had killed a human being, carefully cut up their body, and disposed of the pieces in the river. This hand had somehow detached and washed ashore. Captain Lewis ordered his partner to call for backup and a forensics team. Within an hour, search boats and divers were scouring the muddy waters of the Manatee River, looking for the rest of the body, while Captain Lewis placed the hand in an evidence bag and drove it to the county sheriff's crime lab. He hoped the forensic technicians could pull fingerprints from the hand to quickly identify the victim. But when he handed it over, the technicians shook their heads. They explained that because the hand had been in the water for a long time, the skin was severely waterlogged, wrinkled, and badly decomposed. Pulling usable prints would be nearly impossible, but they promised to try everything they could. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The river search found no other body parts, and the crime lab had no success with the fingerprint. Captain Lewis had no choice but to put the case on the back burner. Then, in June of 1998, nearly 8 months after the hand was found, Captain Lewis was sitting in his office when his phone rang. It was the crime lab. The technician on the line sounded incredibly excited. They had finally made a massive breakthrough. When the standard fingerprinting methods failed, they decided to try a highly advanced, incredibly delicate technique. They carefully peeled off the individual outer layers of skin from the decomposed fingers. By flattening these thin layers of skin and piecing them back together like a puzzle, they were able to reconstruct a clean, clear fingerprint. They ran the reconstructed print through the Florida State database, and to their absolute amazement, they got a match. The hand belonged to a man named Willie Suttle. Captain Lewis immediately got to work researching Willie Suttle. He found that Willie was a retired garbage collector who had lived a quiet, low-profile life in Bradenton. He had a very minor criminal history, nothing serious, but as Captain Lewis kept digging, he found something that made him stop in his tracks. There was no missing person report for Willie Suttle. In fact, according to official state records, Willie Suttle was already dead. But he had not been reported murdered. Captain Lewis found Willie's official death certificate, and it stated that Willie had died of natural causes 5 months before his severed hand washed up on the riverbank. The certificate also stated that Willie had been buried in a local cemetery following a standard, peaceful service, and no police had ever been involved because there was no suspicion of foul play. Captain Lewis was completely bewildered. How could a man who died of natural causes and was buried in a cemetery have his severed hand wash up on a riverbank months later? The next day, which was Friday, June 26, 1998, Captain Lewis, along with a team of officers, investigators, and cemetery workers, gathered at the local cemetery where Willie Suttle was buried. They brought in heavy equipment to exhume his casket. Captain Lewis expected that the casket would be empty. He assumed that grave robbers had dug up Willie's body, stolen it, and perhaps cut it up for some bizarre reason. The workers dug down, pulled the heavy metal casket to the surface, and set it on the grass. Captain Lewis stepped forward and slowly opened the lid. He was shocked to see that the casket was not empty. Willie Suttle's body was indeed lying inside. He was wearing his burial clothes, but as Captain Lewis looked closer, he saw that Willie's left arm was missing its hand. The cut on the wrist matched the surgical precision of the hand found in the river. But that was not the most disturbing part. At the bottom of the casket, lying in a messy, decomposing pile, were all of Willie's internal organs. They had been completely removed from his chest and abdomen and simply tossed into the bottom of the box. Captain Lewis knew he was looking at something incredibly sinister. Why would someone exhume a body, cut off its hand, remove all its internal organs, throw the organs in the bottom of the casket, and then bury it again? It made absolutely no sense. He had the body sent immediately to the county medical examiner for a full autopsy. Later that afternoon, the medical examiner began his examination. The first thing he noticed was that even though Willie's organs had been removed and thrown into the bottom of the casket, his midsection did not look deflated or caved in. It actually looked full, firm, and bloated as if something was still inside. The medical examiner took his scalpel and carefully cut open the stitches on Willie's abdomen. When he pulled the skin back and looked inside the cavity, he froze in absolute disbelief. He had been a medical examiner for decades, but he had never seen anything like this. Inside Willie's empty chest and abdominal cavity, where his lungs, heart, and stomach should have been, someone had stuffed 12 handmade voodoo dolls. The dolls were made of cloth and straw. Pinned to each of the dolls were small pieces of paper with handwritten names on them. The medical examiner immediately took photographs of the inside of the body and sent them to Captain Lewis. When Captain Lewis saw the photos, he knew they had to find the person responsible for this horrific desecration. He looked at the paperwork for Willie's funeral and burial. The services had been handled by a local funeral home owned and operated by a 45-year-old woman named Paula Green Albritton. She ran the business with the help of her son. Captain Lewis went to the funeral home and brought Paula in for an interview. During the interrogation, Captain Lewis asked Paula about Willie Suttle's burial. Paula acted very calm and sweet. She explained that Willie had died in extreme poverty. He had no family, no money, and no way to pay for a proper burial. Paula said she felt terrible for him, so she decided to perform the burial services completely for free as a charitable act of community service. But Captain Lewis did not buy her story. He kept pressing her, asking detailed questions about the state of Willie's body. He eventually showed her the photographs of the voodoo dolls found inside the chest cavity. Paula's calm demeanor began to crack. She realized the police had exhumed the body and discovered her secret. She eventually confessed to what she had done, and the details of her confession were deeply disturbing. It turned out that Paula's funeral home business was in severe financial trouble. She was deeply in debt and her business was on the verge of bankruptcy. She was desperate for a way to save it. She was a practitioner of voodoo and believed that she could use magic to destroy her competitors and force all the funeral business in the city to come to her. But to perform this powerful prosperity ritual, she needed a fresh human corpse. When Willie Suttle died of natural causes and had no family to claim him, Paula saw her opportunity. She offered to bury him for free so she could get her hands on his body. Once she and her son had the body in their prep room, they began the ritual. Her son used a surgical saw to carefully cut off Willie's left hand. Then they sliced open his chest and abdomen, pulled out all of his internal organs, and tossed them to the side. Paula had created 12 voodoo dolls, each representing one of the other competing funeral homes in the local area. She wrote the names of these competing businesses on slips of paper and pinned them to the dolls. She then stuffed the 12 dolls deep inside Willie's empty body cavity and stitched him back up. She threw his loose organs into the bottom of the casket, placed his stuffed body on top, and buried him. But they still had the severed left hand. According to the ritual, the hand had to be disposed of in moving water to wash away the strength of her competitors. Paula put the hand in a plastic bag, added some heavy weights to keep it submerged, and had her son throw it into the Manatee River. She truly believed that this dark ritual would cause her competitors to suffer terrible tragedies, forcing them to close down, which would leave her funeral home as the only business in town. She thought she had committed the perfect crime, but she had made one critical mistake. The plastic bag she used to sink the hand eventually tore open, and the gases from the decomposing hand caused it to float to the surface and wash ashore, where it was spotted by the walker. 2 days after her interview, police arrested Paula Green Albritton and her son. In 1999, they went to trial. They were charged with the severe desecration of a human corpse. Both were found guilty. Paula's son was sentenced to serve 1 year in prison. But the story took a highly controversial and frustrating turn for Captain Lewis and the prosecutors. Shortly after the trial, Paula's defense team filed an appeal. They argued that during her initial interrogation, the police detectives had made a critical error. The detectives had told Paula that she could not be prosecuted if the ritual was part of a recognized religious practice, suggesting she was protected under the United States Constitution's freedom of religion. Believing she was safe, Paula had openly confessed, stating that she practiced voodoo and that the ritual was a sacred part of her religious beliefs. The appeals court reviewed the case and ruled that the detectives had misled her during the interrogation, making her confession involuntary and inadmissible in court. Without her confession, the prosecution did not have enough direct evidence to sustain her conviction. Paula's conviction was overturned and she walked free. She never served time for the horrific desecration of Willie Suttle's body. These 3 stories, as different as they are, all leave us with a lingering, haunting sense of unease. They remind us of how incredibly fragile our lives are and how easily a routine day can turn into a tragedy. In the case of Paulette Landrieu, a loving husband was left in agony for 2 years, only for a random internet map to reveal that his wife was just yards away, trapped in the thorns. In the case of Xiang Liu Juan, a mother's ultimate sacrifice saved her young son, but exposed a shocking level of negligence in a place built for family joy. And in the bizarre case of Willie Suttle, a man who passed away in quiet poverty was used as a pawn in a dark, desperate attempt to gain business success, leaving behind a chilling mystery that ended with no true justice. These cases show us that sometimes the answers we seek are closer than we think, but the truths they reveal are far more disturbing than we could ever imagine. Thank you so much for watching. Short, an 83-year-old woman vanished without a trace, and the clue that solved the mystery was hiding on Google Maps. In 2020, Paulette Landrieu, who suffered from Alzheimer's, disappeared from her home in Belgium. Police searched everywhere. Helicopters. K-9 units. Neighbors, nothing. Some feared she had been abducted. Then, 2 years later, a neighbor spotted something chilling on Google Street View. A photo taken the day she vanished showed Paulette walking away from her home, while her husband unknowingly hung laundry in the backyard. Detectives followed her path. The truth was devastating. Her remains were found hidden in thick brush just across the road. How did an entire search team miss her for 2 years? The full story is on the channel. On a Sunday afternoon, March 12, 2006, 39-year-old Michael Zamiti Jr. was driving his ATV across a frozen lake in Freedom, New Hampshire. Even though it was freezing cold and the air felt sharp against his face, Mike couldn't help but smile. He just loved being out here. Most of the year, Mike lived about 2 hours away in Wakefield, Massachusetts, but this place, Freedom, was special. His parents had a vacation house here, so he'd been coming up to this tiny lakeside community his whole life. It always felt like a second home, a place where he could get away from it all and just breathe. Recently, Mike had even bought his own vacation house in Freedom, just a little ways down the street from his parents. It was a huge accomplishment for him. He ran a successful cement contracting company called All-State Concrete Pumping, and he had poured years of hard work into building a good life for his wife, Michelle, and their 3 kids. Buying this second house felt like proof that all that work had paid off. But that same work had also created some problems in his marriage. Running a company meant long hours and a lot of responsibility. Michelle and the kids were often on their own, which meant she handled most of the parenting and household duties by herself. And she had recently made it very clear to Mike that even though his success was great, his constant absence was incredibly hard on her. As Mike was out on the lake, kind of thinking through all of this, he saw another ATV heading his way. As it got closer, he recognized the driver. It was Sean Fitzpatrick, the other major problem in his marriage. Sean was one of their neighbors up at the lake and had been a close friend of the family for years. He was retired and lived in Freedom full-time. Whenever the Zamitas were in town, Sean would come over for dinner or barbecues. He'd take their kids out on the boat. He was around so often that Mike's kids called him Uncle Sean. But last summer, Mike had discovered that his wife, Michelle, had been cheating on him with Sean. The news had completely shattered Mike. But he and Michelle had agreed they didn't want to give up on their marriage. They started going to therapy together and were trying to work through it. As for Mike and Sean, well, they hadn't spoken a single word to each other since Mike found out about the affair. Mike hated confrontation. It was just easier for him to avoid Sean altogether and focus on rebuilding his relationship with Michelle. So now, seeing Sean driving right towards him, Mike's first instinct was to just turn his ATV around and speed away. But it was too late. Sean was already waving him down. Mike slowed to a stop and waited for Sean to pull up alongside him. Sean didn't waste any time. He told Mike he was glad he ran into him, that he'd been wanting to apologize for what happened last summer with Michelle. He said it wasn't okay, and he hoped they could just put it all behind them. Mike was genuinely surprised by how sincere Sean sounded. So, he just said, you know what, it's all good. He didn't mean it, of course. It definitely was not all good. But again, Mike was not a confrontational person. All he wanted was to end this awkward conversation and get away from Sean. He also genuinely needed to get going. He, Michelle, and the kids were supposed to be heading back to Wakefield soon, and he wanted to help Michelle finish packing up the house. So Mike quickly told Sean he had to go. Before Sean could say anything else, Mike turned his ATV around and gunned it back across the ice toward his house. About 15 minutes later, Mike walked through the front door. The first thing he saw was a row of suitcases, all packed and lined up by the door. He realized Michelle had already done all the work. A moment later, she came into the room and gave him a kiss. She told him the kids were just finishing up cleaning their rooms, and then they could all head out in a few minutes. Just then, they heard a car horn beep twice from outside. Michelle kind of rolled her eyes and laughed. They both knew exactly who it was. It was Mike's parents. They had also been up in Freedom for the weekend at their house down the street, and they were also making the 2-hour drive back to Wakefield that afternoon. Michelle found it amusing that Mike and his father couldn't seem to go a single day without talking to each other. Mike's dad was also named Michael, and the name wasn't the only thing they shared. They were best friends and business partners. Michael Sr. owned the company that Mike ran, All-State Concrete. It was a family business, and Mike Jr. had never considered doing anything else. He'd gone straight into the concrete business right after high school, and he and his dad had been working side by side ever since. Like any business, All-State Concrete had faced its share of struggles, including a stressful lawsuit from a former employee. But for the most part, the company was a huge success. Right now, they were busier than ever. Working on a massive construction project in Boston, Mike headed outside to say hi to his parents and talk a little business with his dad. He asked his father if he had called their employee, Chester Roberts, yet. Mike and his dad had plans to be at the office first thing the next morning, and Mike wanted to make sure Chester would be there too. Chester worked for them part-time as a driver and a handyman. He was by far their most reliable employee, so whenever they had a busy week coming up, they always made sure to call Chester in. To Mike Jr.'s relief, his dad said yes, he'd already spoken to Chester, and they were all set for the morning. After a few more minutes of chatting, they all said their goodbyes. Mike Jr. told his dad he'd see him tomorrow, just before 8 o'clock the next morning, Monday, March 13th. Mike Jr. pulled his truck into the parking lot of All-State Concrete in Wakefield. He was right on time. He saw he was the first one there, so he got out and hurried across the lot to get out of the rain. He unlocked the side door next to one of the large garage bays and went inside. The Allstate building was essentially a massive garage with 3 huge roll-up doors for their cement trucks. But it also had an office upstairs where Mike and his father handled all their administrative work. After entering the garage, Mike went up the stairs that led to his office on the 2nd level. He sat down at his desk and started reviewing the week's schedule. A few minutes later, he heard another vehicle pull into the parking lot. Mike figured it was probably his father, since Chester often walked to the office. Then, Mike Jr. heard the downstairs door open and the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. A few minutes after that, Mike's father, Mike Sr., pulled his own truck into the Allstate concrete parking lot and parked right next to his son's. He got out and walked quickly toward the building's side door to escape the rain. But when he tried to push the door open, it got stuck. It would only open a few inches. Something was blocking it from the inside. He peered through the crack to see what was in the way, and his body went cold. There was a man lying face down on the floor inside, in the middle of a huge pool of blood. It was dark inside the building, so Michael Sr. couldn't see the man's face. He didn't know who it was, but he had a gut feeling it wasn't his son. Mike Jr. was a big guy, and even in the dim light, he could tell this man had a different build. Michael Sr.'s heart was pounding in his chest. His only thought was to back away, pull out his cell phone, and call 911. After he got off the phone with the dispatcher, who told him help was on the way, Mike Sr. realized he couldn't just stand there and wait for the police. There was someone either dead or very badly hurt inside his garage, and his son was likely somewhere inside too. His truck was parked right there. He had to go in and make sure his son was okay. So Michael Sr. moved away from the blocked side door and walked over to one of the big roll-up garage doors. He pulled it open. Once it was up, he didn't see anyone. He just ran inside and started frantically screaming his son's name. But Mike Jr. didn't answer. There was no sign of him anywhere on the main floor. Finally, Mike Sr. ran to the staircase and sprinted up to the 2nd floor office. As soon as he burst through the office door, he stopped dead in horror. There, slumped in the desk chair, was the blood-covered body of his son. Over an hour later, Massachusetts State Trooper Kevin Baker pulled his car up in front of Allstate Concrete. He could see the large building was already surrounded by yellow caution tape. There were at least a dozen crime scene techs and officers from the Wakefield Police Department moving in and out of an open garage door, carefully collecting evidence. Baker wasn't a Wakefield officer, he was with the state police, but in Massachusetts, it was standard procedure for state troopers to conduct homicide investigations alongside the local authorities. And Baker had a strong feeling this case would need all the help it could get. A town like Wakefield just didn't see many homicides. It was located about 10 miles north of Boston and had a reputation for being a peaceful, safe place. It was the kind of small town where everybody seemed to know each other. Baker got out of his cruiser and started looking for the officer in charge. He didn't have to look for long. An officer quickly approached him and introduced himself as Detective Richard Cass with the Wakefield Police. Cass told Baker to follow him. As they walked toward the open garage door, he gave Baker a quick briefing on the situation. There were 2 male victims inside, both deceased. Both had been shot. They had been discovered by the company's owner, Michael Zamiti Sr., a little after 8 o'clock that morning. Baker followed Cass into the garage and over to the first body, which was lying face down on the concrete floor, just inside that smaller side door. Cass explained that this victim was 51-year-old Chester Roberts, a part-time truck driver for Allstate. Identifying him hadn't been difficult. Chester was well known around town for doing handyman work, and he was known personally by many of the local officers, including Detective Cass himself. When Baker examined the body, he could tell right away that Chester had been shot in the back. It looked like a single shot, most likely from a shotgun, given the spray pattern of pellets that had entered his body. Chester had no other visible injuries and, importantly, no defensive wounds. As Baker stood up and scanned the garage, he also didn't see any signs of a robbery or a struggle. There was expensive-looking equipment sitting all around, but nothing was knocked over or out of place. Baker's initial thought was that Chester's killer had probably snuck up on him and shot him in the back before he even knew what was happening. Baker spent a few more minutes checking the doors and windows. Again, he saw no signs of forced entry or anything else out of the ordinary, but that didn't mean much. Chester had likely opened up the shop for the day and started his work, and the killer could have just walked in right after him. After finishing his initial assessment of the first floor, Baker told Cass he was ready to head upstairs to see the second body. Moments later, Cass led Baker into the 2nd floor office where the body of 39-year-old Mike Zamiti Jr. had been found. Detective Cass said sadly that just like with Chester, he also knew Mike personally. Mike Jr. hadn't just been shot in the torso like Chester, he'd been shot in the face as well as the chest. The force of the shotgun blast had been so powerful that his desk and all the surrounding paperwork were drenched in blood. For the most part, Mike's features were unrecognizable, but what struck Baker the most wasn't just how gruesome the scene was. It was the fact that Mike Jr. was still slumped in his office chair. It looked like the killer had come up here with a very specific purpose: to execute Mike. They had marched straight into the office, ignored everything else, and shot Mike point blank in the face before he even had a chance to stand up. This felt incredibly intentional. Somebody had come here specifically to kill Mike. As Baker processed this, a theory began to form in his mind. This likely meant that Mike Jr. was the first one shot, probably before Chester had even arrived at the building. Otherwise, Mike would have heard the loud shotgun blast from downstairs and wouldn't have been so caught off guard just sitting at his desk. If Mike was indeed the first victim, it further suggested he was the primary target of this attack. The crime scene, while gruesome, was remarkably clean in other ways. There were no bloody footprints or any other indication that the killer had lingered or interacted with the scene. Given the Italian-American family's involvement in the construction business, the thought of a mafia connection was hard to ignore. Baker mentioned his thoughts to Cass as he continued to survey the office. As Cass listened, a thoughtful expression came over his face. He said he knew the Zamitis pretty well and that Mike Jr. and his father were genuinely good people. He found it hard to believe they could be involved in any kind of shady mafia business. But he had to admit that it was a possibility, especially since the Zamitis were contractors on a project known as the Big Dig. This detail immediately made Baker's ears perk up. The Big Dig was, at the time, the largest construction project in the entire country. It involved building a massive tunnel under the harbor in Boston. But the project had become a total disaster for the city. It was way over budget, had been going on for 15 years and still wasn't finished. The project had also become infamous for its connections to mafia dealings and corrupt payoffs. So now, Baker had to seriously consider whether the Zamitis had either gotten involved in these seedy deals or had perhaps accidentally angered the wrong person on the job. But even if the murders had nothing to do with the mob, Baker was still convinced that the killer was somehow connected to their business. It had to be someone who had maybe worked at Allstate Concrete or perhaps a client. Someone who would know Mike's routine, where his office was in the building, and that he would be there early in the morning. And while the second victim, Chester's, was probably not the main target, Baker wasn't sure yet why he had been killed. He could have just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe he was somehow caught up in the same conflict as the Zamitis. For a moment, Baker just stood there, staring at the scene, at the blood-soaked paperwork scattered across the desk. Then he turned to Cass and said they would need a list of all of Allstate's employees and clients. Baker then spent a little more time walking around the office, looking for any other evidence. He noticed a 16-gauge shotgun shell on the floor. He called over a nearby tech and told her to bag it and to search for any other shells. Baker and Cass then headed back outside, where a crowd of onlookers had already started to gather behind the police perimeter. Once they were outside, Trooper Baker asked Cass if they could start by interviewing the person who had discovered the bodies, Michael Zamiti Sr., but Detective Cass shook his head and said no. He explained that when he had first arrived at the scene, Michael Sr. had been so distraught over finding his son that he could barely speak. So Cass had simply sent him home. Another Wakefield officer had done the same thing when Mike Jr.'s wife, Michelle Zamiti, showed up at the scene, completely hysterical. She had heard there was an accident, and when officers told her that her husband was dead, they had taken her home as well. Baker understood, but he wasn't happy to hear it. He always preferred to speak to witnesses and family members as quickly as possible and in person. In any murder investigation, a spouse is always a potential suspect, so he was especially disappointed to have missed the opportunity to speak with Michelle right away. But there was still plenty of work to do at the scene, and he knew the Wakefield police would know where to find the family later. So, Baker turned to Cass and suggested they start canvassing the nearby businesses. The following morning, March 14th, Trooper Baker parked his car in front of Mike's parents' house in Wakefield. Detective Cass was with him. They were there to speak with Mike Sr. They had just received the autopsy reports for both Chester and Mike, but the reports didn't reveal anything they didn't already know. Chester had been shot once, Mike twice, and both had died within seconds. But the investigators did have one potential new lead from their canvassing of the neighborhood. Even though there were no surveillance cameras at Allstate Concrete itself, some of the surrounding businesses did have them. Baker had officers scrubbing through that footage now. He also had another team of detectives interviewing Chester Roberts' family because there was still an outside chance that Baker had it all wrong and that Chester was actually the intended target. Besides that, the crime scene technicians hadn't found much physical evidence. There were no usable fingerprints, and because it had been raining on the day of the murders, they hadn't been able to collect any clear footprints or tire tracks from outside the building. So now Baker reached up and knocked on the front door of the Zamiti house, hoping that Mike Sr. would be able to point them in the right direction. A minute later, Baker and Cass were sitting in the living room with Mike Sr. and Pat, Mike's mom. Both of Mike's parents were incredibly emotional. Michael Sr. was visibly shaking, while Pat just sat there quietly crying. Seeing how upset they still were, Baker realized that Cass had made the right call in sending Michael Sr. home the day before. Even a full 24 hours later, it was clear it was going to be difficult to get any solid information from them. So, Baker decided to keep the interview brief. The first thing he did was ask Mike Sr. to walk him through the discovery of the bodies. He just wanted to hear what happened, in his own words. And what he said lined up perfectly with what Baker had already heard from Cass and from the 911 dispatch records. After Mike Sr. finished recounting that horrible morning, Baker moved on to the real reason he was there. He asked if there was anyone in Mike Jr.'s life who might have wanted to hurt him. Mike Sr. took a few shaky breaths as he considered the question. He said that, there were a few people in the construction industry that he and his son didn't always see eye to eye with, but for the most part, they tried to maintain good relationships with everyone. Getting into fights was just bad for business. But as he was saying this, Mike Sr. suddenly sat up a bit straighter, as if he had just remembered something. He said that, actually, there was a former co-worker who definitely held a grudge against them, his own nephew, Hank Jennings. A few years ago, Hank had gotten angry with them over unpaid overtime wages and had actually filed a lawsuit against the company. They had eventually paid Hank a settlement, but there was still a lot of bad blood between them. Mike Sr. glanced over at his wife, Pat, who just nodded and said the whole ordeal had been extremely stressful and volatile. Baker took down Hank's information, talked with Mike's parents for a few more minutes, and then he and Cass stood up to leave. Baker knew he would need to speak with the Xamidus again, but for now, he decided to give them a break. He and Cass would focus on looking into Hank Jennings. 2 days later, Baker was sitting in Cass's office at the Wakefield Police Department, poring over crime scene photos and witness statements. He was starting to feel antsy. After his meeting with Mike's parents, he had been hopeful about speaking with Hank Jennings, the disgruntled former employee who was also Mike's cousin. But even though Baker and Cass had sent officers out to find Hank and bring him in for an interview, they hadn't been able to locate him yet. They had, however, managed to get in touch with Mike's wife, Michelle, and had questioned her at her home in Wakefield. But she hadn't given them much to go on. She said she was at home with her kids at the time of her husband's death, and that she honestly didn't know of anyone who would want to hurt Mike. Also, Baker and Cass had looked into Allstate Concrete's financial statements and had found nothing to suggest that anything shady or mafia-related was happening with the company. Still, Baker knew they were in a better position than they had been a few days ago. This was mainly because they had finally had a chance to review all of the surveillance footage from the businesses around Allstate. And one of those cameras had been aimed at the street right outside the company's property. The angle didn't show the Allstate parking lot itself, but it did show every vehicle that entered and exited that parking lot from the main street. This particular camera had captured Mike Jr.'s truck arriving at work at 7:39 a.m. Then, at 7:44 a.m., just 5 minutes later, an unknown green pickup truck was seen pulling in as well. A few minutes after that, Chester Roberts was seen arriving at Allstate on foot. And then at 7:50 a.m., that same green truck was seen leaving the parking lot just 12 minutes before Michael Sr.'s red truck arrived at 8:02 a.m., so it seemed very likely that the killer had been driving that green truck and had killed both Mike and Chester in the 6-minute window between 7:44 a.m. and 7:50 a.m. The video quality wasn't good enough to show the driver of this mysterious green truck or to make out its license plate. It also didn't capture the driver getting out of the vehicle and entering the building. But just knowing the style and color of what was very likely the killer's vehicle could definitely help them narrow down their list of potential suspects. Just then, the desk phone rang. Baker watched as Cass picked it up and said hello. A confused look came over Cass's face. He listened for a moment, then thanked the caller and said they would be right over. He hung up the phone and told Baker that that was Michelle Zamidi. She had called to say that she had new information to give them, something she hadn't mentioned in her first interview, and that it was very important. About 15 minutes later, Baker and Cass sat down across from Michelle in her living room for the second time. To Baker, Michelle seemed like a completely different person from the last time they had spoken. 2 days ago, she had seemed horrified and overcome with grief, but now she just seemed incredibly nervous. She kept touching her hair and fiddling with a stack of condolence cards on the coffee table. Baker commented on how many cards there were, and Michelle just nodded. She said so many people had reached out to send their support, all their friends and neighbors from Wakefield and from Freedom, New Hampshire, where their second home was. Then Michelle took a deep breath and got straight to the point. She said that she had withheld information about one of her neighbors in Freedom. His name was Sean Fitzpatrick, and she had been having an affair with him. Baker cleared his throat in surprise and asked her to continue. Michelle's eyes filled with tears as she explained how Mike Jr. worked so much and that she and the kids spent a lot of time at their lake house. That meant they also spent a lot of time with Sean, and eventually, their friendship had blossomed into a romance. Baker could hardly believe what he was hearing. A secret love triangle gave both Sean and Michelle a powerful motive to want Mike out of the picture. But before he could ask any follow-up questions, Michelle quickly added that her husband had actually known all about her affair. They had been in therapy together and had really started to turn their marriage around. She said that about a month ago, she had officially and completely broken things off with Sean, and she added, Sean had been really upset about it. Baker shared a look with Cass. He could tell they were both thinking the same thing. They obviously needed to talk to Sean immediately. But also, Michelle was now right back at the top of their suspect list. Maybe she had wanted her husband gone so she could be with Sean. And maybe the only reason she was telling them all of this now was to try to get ahead of the story. But they would need a lot more evidence before they could prove any of that. So, for now, Baker simply got Sean's phone number and address from Michelle and told her they would be in touch. Later that same night, Baker and Cass were once again in Cass's office. But this time, another officer was with them, there to give them a crucial update. After speaking with Michelle, Baker had sent a team of officers up to Freedom, New Hampshire to speak with Sean Fitzpatrick, the neighbor she'd been having an affair with. And now, one of those officers was back in Wakefield to report on what he had learned. The very first thing Baker wanted to know wasn't about the conversation itself. He just asked, "Did you see a green truck in Sean's driveway?" But the officer shook his head. He said Sean did own a truck, but it was bright red. He then went on to explain that when they had spoken to Sean, he had completely denied having an affair with Michelle. Sean had admitted that he dated a lot of women, but he insisted that he and Michelle were just close family friends. The officers who were interviewing Sean just let him talk, never revealing that they already knew Michelle had confessed everything to them and that they knew Sean was lying. Baker almost laughed when he heard this. He didn't believe Sean's story for a second, and the fact that he was lying so blatantly made him seem pretty guilty. But before Baker could say so, the officer added one more critical piece of information. He said that Sean actually had a solid alibi. He had been at home on the morning of the murders, and one of his neighbors had confirmed it. This particular neighbor took a walk every morning at 9 a.m., and she had seen Sean outside his house right around that time. Baker sighed in frustration. It took about 2 hours to drive between Freedom and Wakefield. That meant Sean would not have had enough time to kill Mike and Chester by 7:50 a.m. in Wakefield and then make it all the way back to Freedom to be seen by his neighbor at 9 a.m. And just like that, Sean Fitzpatrick felt like another very promising lead that had just turned into a dead end. On March 18th, 5 days after the murders of Mike Zamidi and Chester Roberts, detectives Baker and Cass stood at the back of a church in Wakefield, Massachusetts. They were at Mike's funeral and the church was absolutely packed. But the investigators weren't just there to pay their respects. They were also there to finally speak to Hank Jennings, Mike's cousin, who had filed that lawsuit against the company. They still hadn't been able to officially get a hold of him, so Cass had suggested they just corner him at the funeral. He was very likely to attend because, despite the rift with the Zamidis, he was still family. When the service ended and everyone stood to leave, Baker felt a nudge on his arm. Cass leaned over and whispered that they'd been right. He pointed out Hank in the crowd. As the attendees began to file out of the church, the two investigators made their way over to Hank and stepped in front of him just before he could get outside. Baker immediately noticed that Hank's entire body tensed up the moment they blocked his path, like he was about to make a run for it. So, Baker just cut to the chase. He said, "Hank, will you please come with us and answer a few questions?" Hank's eyes went wide. He just said, "No way, not without my lawyer." Then he pushed past the investigators and hurried out of the church. Baker and Cass didn't follow him. Instead, they just exchanged a look. They were now both convinced that Hank Jennings was their primary suspect. 5 weeks after the funeral, in mid-April of 2006, State Trooper Kevin Baker sat in Detective Cass's office at the Wakefield Police Department. He was wearing gloves and holding a piece of paper that looked like an old-fashioned ransom note. It was covered in letters that had been crudely cut out of a newspaper and pasted onto the page. The message was alarming: "Close business now, or more family will die." The note had been brought to them by Mike Jr.'s mother, Pat, who said the family had received it in the mail that morning. For the Zamidis, this letter was terrifying. It was not just a grim reminder of their son's murder, but also a direct threat of more violence to come. But for Baker, the note was a lead, and they desperately needed one. It had been over a month since Michael and Chester were killed, and by this point, the two investigators had managed to rule out basically every one of their suspects. And that list now included Hank Jennings. They had learned that Hank's reluctance to speak with them at the funeral wasn't because of guilt. It was because he had signed a non-disclosure agreement as part of his settlement with the Zamidis, and he was afraid of violating it. When they did finally get him to talk, he had a clear alibi. He was at his job when Mike and Chester were killed, and Baker and Cass had confirmed it with his employer. And while Hank did own several shotguns, none of them were 16 gauge. So, Hank joined the growing pile of discarded suspects. This pile included Michelle, who certainly had a motive to kill Mike Jr., but she had been incredibly cooperative and they hadn't found a single piece of evidence to suggest she was involved, like maybe hiring a hitman. And her ex-lover, Sean, was also very suspicious and had a strong motive, but his alibi had cleared him. There was just no way Sean could have been in Wakefield at the time of the murders. because his neighbor had seen him over 100 miles away just an hour later. And so now this strange, threatening note seemed to point back to the very first theory that Baker and Cass had considered and then ruled out, that the murders were business-related and that the mafia was involved. Cass, being a local, told Baker that a lot of rumors had been swirling around town about the murders. Because of the Xamatus work on the Big Dig, the general consensus in Wakefield was that the mob theory made the most sense, but Baker wasn't so sure. They had looked into the Xamatus books and financial records repeatedly and had found nothing to suggest any shady deals or mob connections. Also, Baker just didn't think this ransom-style note, made from newspaper clippings, was the mob style. It felt kind of silly and performative. It seemed more like someone was trying to make it look like the mob to lead the investigation down the wrong path. But even if that was the case, this note was still a huge break. Because maybe, just maybe, whoever had sent it had left their fingerprints or their DNA on it. So, Baker carefully bagged up the note and Cass took it to be sent off to the crime lab. Baker knew it would take some time to get the results back, so while they waited, he decided he wanted to re-interview every single suspect and every single witness, just in case they had overlooked something. A few days later, Baker was sitting alone at Cass's desk, reading through another witness statement. He had been re-energized by the new evidence they had gathered and was feeling optimistic about their chances of solving the case. In addition to conducting all the new interviews, they had gotten some forensic results back from that threatening letter. The lab had found both DNA and a clear palm print on it. Now, all they needed was a suspect to compare it to. Just then, the office door flew open and a very excited Detective Cass barged in. An hour later, Baker and Cass walked up the front steps of Michelle Zamiti's house and knocked on her front door. When she answered, they asked for her permission to come inside and retrieve a specific small object from her house. Michelle, who seemed a bit confused by their request, said, "Okay, come on in." The two detectives walked right past her, went straight to the object they were looking for, bagged it as evidence, and walked right back outside. They immediately sent it off to the crime lab, and as soon as the lab results came back, Baker and Cass knew they had finally solved the case, based on DNA, other forensic evidence, and witness statements. Here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Michael Zamiti Jr. and Chester Roberts on the morning of March 13, 2006. At around 7:45 a.m., the killer quietly crept up the stairs that led to Mike's office. They were carrying a shotgun, and their heart was racing. They were nervous about what they were about to do, but in their mind, Mike Jr. had to go. That was all there was to it. When the killer reached the office door, they barely hesitated before pushing it open and raising the shotgun. Mike was sitting in his chair at his desk. When the door opened, he turned to see who it was. As soon as Mike Jr. saw them standing there with a gun pointed at him, his eyes widened in shock, but the killer fired 2 quick blasts before Mike could even move, hitting him in the face and the chest. Mike immediately slumped over in his chair and stopped moving. The killer then turned and ran back down the stairs to the garage. But just before they could leave, they froze. They heard the sound of footsteps approaching the building's side door from outside. The killer instinctively ducked and hid, not sure what to do, waiting to see if this person would come inside or just leave. A moment later, the door opened and a man, Chester Roberts, stepped inside. The killer leaped out from their hiding spot and shot him once in the back. Chester dropped to the ground, dead. After killing Chester, the killer was in shock. They hadn't planned on killing a second person. Mike was the only target, but they also knew they couldn't just stand around and wait for more people to show up. So, the killer left the building, jumped into the green pickup truck they had stolen from one of their neighbors, and peeled out of the parking lot less than 10 minutes after they had first arrived. As they drove away, they gripped the steering wheel tightly. They knew they should feel guilty for what they had just done. But instead, all they felt was a sense of relief, because now they could finally be with the love of their life. It turns out Michael Zamiti Jr. and Chester Roberts were not murdered by Mike's wife, Michelle, or by his cousin Hank, or by the mob. They were killed by Mike Jr.'s lakeside neighbor and his wife's lover, Sean Fitzpatrick. When Michelle had tried to break things off with Sean, she had told him that the only way she would ever leave Mike was if Mike ended the marriage himself, or if something happened to him. Michelle had meant it as a way to let him down easy, but Sean took it as a twisted suggestion. So, he decided to murder Mike Jr. so he could have Michelle all to himself. He stole the green pickup truck from a neighbor who was out of town, drove it to Wakefield, committed the murders, and then drove back. That neighbor who had provided Sean's alibi, the one who said they saw him at his house in Freedom around 9:90 a.m., had made it seem impossible for Sean to be the killer. But that same neighbor later called the police to amend their statement. They said they had been mistaken and had actually seen Sean later in the day, not at 9 a.m. That single change in their statement created a wide enough window of time on the morning of the murders for it to be absolutely possible for Sean to have driven to Wakefield, committed the murders, and driven back. Once Sean's alibi fell apart, investigators remembered that stack of condolence cards at Michelle's house. They went back to her house to see if Sean had sent one, and he had. When they tested the envelope flap which he had licked to seal, they got his DNA. They then matched that DNA to the DNA found on the threatening ransom-style letter that had been sent to the Zemidis, the letter that Sean had created, and sent himself in a desperate attempt to throw police off his trail and make them think the mob was involved. In June of 2006, Sean Fitzpatrick was arrested. He was eventually convicted and received 2 consecutive life sentences for the murders of Michael Zemidi Jr. and Chester Roberts. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.